King James was a coward. Well, that's according to the work of author Donald Tyson, who argues that cowardice and weakness was a part of the king's nature. This was a man who preferred to lean on the arm of an attendant to walk, who sobbed like a child to his captors, and did very little to prevent the execution of his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, by order of Elizabeth I. Although I suppose you could argue that as he was raised a Protestant, he didn't really have the same religious or political interests as her, and probably didn't know her all that well either. Still, Tyson, in his translation of the Demonology of King James, paints the 16th century king in quite a negative light. He describes him as being unattractive in both appearance and in manners, notes he had a tendency to bluster and make false promises, and remarks of him being slovenly and unclean. All these aspects about him were quietly despised by the English when he ascended to the throne in 1603. But in spite of this, they swallowed their dislike of him, as he was the lesser of two evils. The other option was likely a bitter civil war. Yet, in spite of his unlikable image, he still managed to get a wife. I guess love knows no bounds, in Anne of Denmark, the daughter of the King of Denmark, Frederick II. I mean, I say it's love, but she was like 15. Funnily enough, Tyson notes that the only courageous thing King James ever did in his life was sail out to meet the princess when he learned that her ship had been driven into the port of Oslo in Norway as a result of a particularly belligerent storm. It's here, whilst waiting out the weather in Denmark with his new wife, did King James come to learn of the Danish attitude toward witchcraft, who, having harboured their own superstitions around sorcery and the devil, believed that weather magic was likely being used by witches to assassinate Anne and keep the royal couple apart. This then planted the seed in James's head that he was a special target of Satan himself. This belief was only magnified when, on their return trip back to Britain, another storm accosted the royal fleet, with one ship actually sinking. With this second destructive storm, James became convinced that this was no coincidence, nor a natural weather pattern, but in fact a result of the black magic he had learned of in Denmark, practiced by those who sought to destroy him. This would set off a series of witchcraft trials in Britain, most notably the North Berwick trials, where supposed witches were accused of performing magic in an attempt to take the king and queen's lives. James keenly interested himself in the trials, and was even personally involved in the questioning of accused witches. In fact, you might say that this supernatural threat that he believed loomed over him became something of an obsession, especially after having questioned a purported witch named Agnes Sampson in the North Berwick trials, learned that the devil considered him, this timid, heavy and clumsy oaf of a man, to be his ultimate arch nemesis, and something of a final boss for Satan and his minions. It was with this reason that the devil hated him, and was now working so tirelessly to corrupt people into practicing witchcraft, so as to hasten his death. Samson actually testified that when she asked Satan why he hated James so much, he told her, "By reason the king is the greatest enemy he hath in the world." By such an extraordinary statement, Satan had allegedly given even more prominence to James, who now could not only be considered as a king of both Scotland and England, but was now also something of an avenger of the Christian faith, perhaps the last bastion on the mortal plane that kept the devil and the forces of evil at bay, even though he had probably never even considered such a responsibility before having heard this confession. But alas, the delusions of grandeur were strong with this one. In any case, Tyson notes that as James was an intensely religious man, and as the leader of his nation in matters military, spiritual and judicial, it would have been difficult for him not to assume the role of Satan's chief adversary, something he came to do with great enthusiasm over the next 4 decades. One of the ways in which James waged this spiritual war against the devil was through his Demonology, which, published in 1597, was a philosophical and theological treatise to prove the reality of witchcraft and justify the state's persecution of witches, or those whom acted on behalf of Satan. Structured as a Socratic dialogue between the characters Philomathes, the skeptic, and Epistemon, the expert, the book argued that witchcraft was not merely a folk superstition, but a high-level crime of treason against God. With it, James sought to convince the public of the same sentiments that he too had become convinced by, that the devil was a literal active force in the world, who recruited the weak, primarily women, into a demonic pact to subvert Christian society. The work itself actually begins with a preface from the man himself, where James explains exactly why he's written this treatise and how the 16th century audience would benefit from reading it. He first remarks that witches and enchanters, who were the detestable slaves of the devil, had moved him to write such a work, and that whilst it might seem like he's only written it to show off his considerably learned genius, not sure if anyone was thinking that, but anyway, he's actually written it so as to resolve the doubting hearts that the assaults of Satan are most certainly real, and that the instruments of his work, those pesky witches, must be severely punished. He makes reference to a 16th century author, Reginald Scot here, who at the time would have published his Discovery of Witchcraft, a work that actually provoked James because it not only revealed details about magic, as well as the names and offices of various demons, but it also recorded Scott's sentiments that witches were simply incapable of committing the crimes they were being accused of, and that the whole matter was a result of mass delusion. Naturally, James speaks unfavourably of Scott here, noting that he's wrong for his assumptions, and that much like the Sadducees of old, who also denied such spirits, so too was Scott in the wrong camp. In fact, he would even come to order the gathering and mass burning of Scott's book, for fear it would dilute his own message and undermine the influence of his demonology. Reginald Scot isn't the only one King James takes aim at though, for he turns his sights upon Dutch physician Johann Weyer, known for his works Witches, Devils and Doctors in the Renaissance, and his own demonic classification, The False Monarchy of Demons. Written by James here as Wyrus, Weyer actually annoyed the king in a number of ways, by not only revealing the practical application of ceremonial magic, but also maintained that witchcraft and the dark powers associated with it were not legitimate. Here, James frames Weyer in his Demonology as something of an apologist for witches, and that his efforts to procure their impunity made it seem like he was a witch himself. In other words, if you don't agree with me, then you're probably a witch too. James provides a neat contents of the entire work by telling us, and to make this treatise more pleasant and easy, I have put it in the form of a dialogue, which I have divided into 3 books. The first speaking of magic in general, and necromancy in particular, the second of sorcery and witchcraft, the third containing a discourse of all these kings of spirits and spectres that appear and trouble persons, together with a conclusion of the whole work. This is why I personally never really enjoyed his Demonology. Instead of just explaining his thoughts and feelings, he employs these 2 characters, Philomathes, who's the skeptic, and Epistemon, who's basically himself, and presents his sentiments and ideas by way of a dialogue between these 2 characters. I understand that this might have been an effective way, and perhaps a novel way, of winning over the public in the 16th century, but I've always found this style as pretty condescending, and perhaps even a little insulting. Presenting his findings as a dialogue makes it seem as if his knowledge and research is so incredibly intellectual that he has to dumb it down for us by use of these 2 characters. In a way, it kinda has the opposite effect. It removes the authority of this being the king's word, and in some areas even overcomplicates aspects of his arguments that could have otherwise been explained so much more concisely. To prove my point, the Malleus Maleficarum, arguably the most popular treatise on witchcraft by German clergy Heinrich Kramer, which was published a century before and was still being widely circulated in King James's time, did not utilize characters to express its message, but still managed to overshadow the likes of James's Demonology long after its author had died. Beyond this, James outlines what exactly his intentions are in this labour of writing such a treatise. These he explains in 2 points. Number 1, he hopes to prove to the reader that the devil is real, and that all of his evil arts can and will manifest in the modern day, much as it had done so in biblical times. Number 2, he hopes to delineate exactly how those caught practicing evil arts should be tried, and what their punishments ought to look like. Most of which were death, by the way. With this, James declares that he hopes to identify for the reader what the evil arts look like, and what sort of things the devil's minions can perform. Of course, he can't be too specific, because that would give the whole game away that this was all in his head. But he assures us that the devil's power was infinite, and that we really ought to just believe him. To his credit though, he does venture in providing us with a few examples. In one instance here, he notes that there were those he had witnessed who could have demons bring them all kinds of dainty dishes, and that in the same way a thief might delight in stealing, so too could one's familiar subtly and suddenly transport items in the same manner. In one instance, he notes a familiar of an accused witch actually demonstrated the ability to procure wine by simply pulling it out of a wall. I'm trying to imagine if I had that kind of power. I literally wouldn't get anything done. He also provides another example of this evil art, which can manifest as witches curing or casting diseases, before going on to say that it is known that by the power of the devil, a witch can wilt the nature of man, and thus make him impotent with women, or, on the other hand, can incite a man's nature and make him into an insatiable, horny monster. This actually echoes a point made in the Malleus Maleficarum, where author Heinrich Kramer noted that as a result of witchcraft, a man could be rendered incapable of copulating with his wife, but perfectly adept when it came to another woman. In essence, if a man couldn't rise to the occasion with his wife, but he could with the town harlot, then chances are it wasn't due to the fact that he wasn't attracted to his wife, or had lost interest in her, but that he'd been plagued by a witch's curse. Furthermore, this idea that James touches upon about the evil art wilting the nature of man manifests in several ideas of Kramer, who notes that witches could freeze a man's desire, could make his wife appear loathsome or ugly, or could even prevent the blood flow to his penis so as to ensure he could never penetrate her. Again, these were to be taken not as signs as physical pressure, bodily ailments, or even psychological issues, but rather as a sign that a witch was plaguing the man and preventing him from having sex. In fact, you could even go a step further with Kramer's work, where he notes that witches could cast a sort of illusionary spell that replaced the penis with a smooth patch of skin, thus convincing the man that he could no longer even try to sleep with his wife. In spite of how terrible this all sounds, James implores the reader to consider the fact that whilst the devil has all these devastating abilities, he is not as powerful as God. Therefore, in the vein of Job in the Bible, Satan can only act when and if God gives him explicit permission. This might be some comfort to those who were God-fearing and righteous, but given what we know of Job's story, Job was also God-fearing and righteous, which is what made him such an appealing target for God's wager, which allowed Satan to pretty much ruin his life. But I suppose the point James was trying to drive home was that God was more likely to protect you from the devil's schemes if you were moral and pious, and that if God did allow the devil to attack you, then just like with Job, he did have a greater plan at hand. James refers to the devil here as God's hangman, implying that he can only affect those who have already been marked by God. As with many of these treatises, James inevitably cops out when it comes to going into more detail regarding specific instances of demonic power, telling us, "Having thus declared to you then my full intention in this treatise, you will easily excuse, I doubt not, as well by omitting to declare the whole particular rites and secrets of these unlawful arts, and also their infinite and wonderful practices, as being neither of them pertinent to my purpose. In other words, I could tell you all about the magical powers of witches and demons and exactly how they work, but it's not really relevant. I mean, he was only trying to convince the entire country that demons were real. At the very least, he does give the reader the option of consulting French jurist Jean Bodin's work, Demonomania, where he notes that the more curious of his audience may hear the finer details of the evil practices there. It's actually quite interesting that he even mentions Bodin at all, considering the explicitly sexual content in Demonomania, which would have surely offended his own religious sensibilities. For example, Bodin wrote in his work that Satan could choose to seduce girls as young as 6 years old, and condemn their souls before they were even old enough to understand right from wrong. It's quite ironic that this type of content was basically promoted by the king, but Weah's work, aiming to shed light on the reality of witchcraft, was quickly condemned. He's also seen to recommend the works of two late German writers, Hyperius and Hemingius, whom he notes one would benefit from consulting if they wish to know about the ancient use of magic. Finally, he almost begrudgingly suggests the reading of the 3 books of occult philosophy by German polymath Cornelius Agrippa, for those who wanted to learn of particular rites and curiosities of the black arts, but warns this is unnecessary and also perilous. Kinda makes me wish I started reading that and not this, to be honest. With this, King James concludes, "And so, wishing my pains in this treatise, beloved reader, to be effectual in arming all those that read the same against these above-mentioned errors, and recommending my good will to your friendly acceptance, I bid you hearty farewell." King James's Demonology should not be read simply as the strange obsession of a fearful king, nor as the work of a uniquely cruel or irrational man. It was, quite simply, a product of its time, an age in which belief in witchcraft, demons, divine judgment, and the active presence of Satan was not necessarily an arbitrary threat, but something much more corporeal. James may strike the modern reader as credulous, paranoid, and often dangerously certain, but within the religious and intellectual world he inhabited, his concerns were not necessarily unusual. You must also remember that to him, witchcraft was not merely a provocation against God, but in fact a practice by certain people who were actively trying to kill him. James, who now likely lived in fear anyway of being targeted by the loyalists of his mother, or the English, who had given him a frosty reception, or even the wary Catholic Church, now had to contend with enemies of the supernatural variety. Realistically, considering how on edge he would have been, given that his list of adversaries now included witches who could control storms, it's something of a blessing that the worst thing to come out of his reign was only his demonology. Well, that and the thousands of people who died because of it. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.